Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us across the fence. I'm Fran Stoddard. When we talk about fall in Vermont, we tend to focus on foliage, the weather, and of course, apple picking. So today, we're going to single out the fruit, from pick your own to hard apple ciders. We'll also learn a bit about Vermont grapes. Our guest is the Tree, Fruit, and Viticulture Specialist with the UVM's Plant and Soil Science Department, Dr. Terrence Bradshaw, who oversees research and outreach for apple and grape growers throughout Vermont. He is also the director of the university's Horticulture Research and Education Center. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you.
This is great to have you back. Nothing like fresh apple off the trees. Big picture first. How's the season going?
Yeah, a lot of people see the trees on the side of the roads and backyard trees, and they recognize, they come to me and say, wow, this is a great apple year. The growers must be doing really well. This is one of those years we often talk about, odd-numbered years. Wild or unmanaged trees tend to have a heavy crop. Apples by their nature are biennial, meaning they have a large crop and then a small crop. Right. But what people don't really realize is growers need a crop every year. So I like to say every year is a good apple year. Vermont's a really good place, a good climate to grow apples. And growers put a lot of management and effort into pruning and fertilizing and thinning off fruit and managing pests to have an annual crop. So it is a good year. I expect the per acre rate or harvest will be roughly around average or a little bit above average, probably around 500, 600 bushels per acre in the state.
Okay, fantastic. So pick your own is certainly a popular way to get apples in Vermont. Has that always been the case, and how's that scene going? Yeah,
pick your own really has been around for a long time in Vermont, and kind of the retail phenomenon, it started to expand in the 90s. People don't always realize that apples are the third most valuable crop in the state. We have a large wholesale industry. It's not as large as it used to be maybe 20 years ago, but we still have, I would say, about 1,000 acres that are selling fruits, packing them onto trucks and into storage and through packing houses, and they're then going to grocery stores and local co-ops. And that's kind of the side that people don't see as much. That is really important in terms of being a pretty significant player in the Vermont economy.
Right, and that's regional and really year-round. They're able to supply us with local apples.
Yeah, the magic of cold storage. It's these rooms you drive into. It's a drive-in refrigerator. And 70 years ago, it was really perfected how to best store an apple, and certainly some of the technology that's available allows you to take, especially things like an Empire in April that crunches as hard as it did in October. Didn't exist even 20, 30 years ago, so the quality has gotten much better.
Right, you can really support that here in Vermont.
Absolutely.
Okay. It seems that there's so much interest in hard cider. I remember having to go up to Canada to get hard cider way back in the day, but it's a real industry. So tell us a little bit about that industry and how it's going.
Yeah, so the cider industry has grown substantially really since about 2010. I would say the growth really peaked in 2014, 15, and it's still been growing. Last time I counted, and this number is probably wrong already, there were 16 licensed cideries, which are businesses that make cider, like wineries, cider wine, in the state. And it's interesting in Vermont because we have everything from Woodchuck, which is a major international brand, to Citizen Cider, which is a major regional and even to some degree national brand, and then a lot of smaller brands that might be local or even hyper-local, where they're just selling right off the farm. So we have this real diversity of cider tastes, cider styles, and that didn't exist, I would say, before maybe 8 or 9 years ago. Where cider now is a category, whereas it used to be kind of an also-ran. There would be one cider in a store, and they wouldn't know where to put it. Somewhere in the beer shelf or the wine shelf, but they would usually wind up on the wine cooler shelf. Now there's whole sections in stores.
Right.
And, it's really changed the landscape both of the beverage industry, but to some degree the apple industry.
Right, so let's talk about that. Well, first, let's talk about research that you have been doing and continue to do on cider and cider apples.
Sure. So around 2013-14, we at the UVM Apple team were seeing this change in the market and seeing how there was more cider being used, and recognizing apples go into every bottle. So we spent some time mostly working with some of the larger cideries. And it was interesting, they and some of the larger orchards were interested in how do we get more Vermont apples in the bottle. And a lot of that came down to using some of the apples we're already growing. So Macintosh, mostly Macintosh, Empire, Cortland.
Dessert apples is mainly what they use.
Dessert
right?
apples, what we call dessert apples.
Right.
Since then, and we know how to do that. We know how to grow apples, and actually those are a second tier apple. It's a lower grade apple that goes into those bottles. Where we can have higher value ciders and therefore higher value apples is when growers grow apples that are specific to making cider. And so we've been doing some research over the years, and we are just about to start a fairly large project funded by Northeast SARE program. I'm working on it as the project director with UMass and UMaine, called the New England Cider Apple Project, or NECAP. We'll be launching it this fall with a new website, and the idea behind there is to work on cider-specific varieties, work with growers who are growing them now to collect some of their data and some of their observations around them and collate that into a guide that other growers can use, because it's a really risky proposition.
Right. You don't want people to tear up part of their orchard and put these in without really knowing how
right.
it's going to work.
It's a completely different market. So
you're looking into it.
We're looking into it. Growers are looking into it. I would say I would even say the national growers have been cautiously dipping their toes in the water with some of these new varieties. And we're also being cautious about it, recognizing the amount of risk that's involved. So the way to minimize or reduce your risk is to go in with information. So we're working on developing that information and also following up with some science to try to address some of the problems that we do know that some of these varieties have.
Now, just clarification for me: when you say second tier apples like Max or they're Grape Max, it's just when they're separated.
Yeah,
is that what you're talking about?
In the packing house.
Because Macs are great.
Macs are great. No problem with Macs. No problem with Empires, Cortlands. The things we grow, and we grow very well, and we're world class at doing it. There's a second tier from the packing house. If they're too small, too green, they might have a defect or something. Those are the fruit that often go to processing, which used to go to sweet cider. And I feel sorry for the sweet cider companies because they now have to pay twice the price for cider apples because the demand from hard cider companies has lifted that price. And that's actually been one of the main benefits, I think, of the cider industry to the apple industry is raising that floor price for cider apples.
So this is all good for orchards.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's look a little bit at grapes and wine. Of course, it's remarkable that we've been entering into this industry for a while. So what is UVM working on in that area? Yeah,
it's interesting. I don't take any of this credit, but basically in the time that I've been working on the UVM fruit program, which has been since the late 90s, is the entire time that we've seen the grape industry in Vermont go from essentially nothing to roughly maybe $4 or $5 million a year industry. Fairly important, about 160, 175 acres, I estimate, of grapes in the state. So they're not an insignificant crop, and they're a high value crop, especially when you make them into wine. We've been working on wine grapes with a few different projects over the years. So my predecessor, Dr. Lorraine Burkett, was a plant pathologist, and she and I worked together with other partners to really help growers learn how to manage pests. That was one of the first things at the ground floor. With a brand new crop that does have relatively easy to manage, but very critical to manage pest issues. We started, developing some kind of a program and teaching growers how to manage them. The other main thing that was important was sorting out which varieties were going to work in Vermont, similar to what we're doing with cider apples.
Right.
So we've been doing variety trials. We did a 10-year trial that we wrapped up a couple years ago, and I've just started phase 2. I don't see us. It took parts of Europe 600 years or so to decide what varieties grow best in what area. It took California about 100 years. We're only 20 years into the industry, and we're still breeding some of these varieties that still have numbers. So they're very new. So we're working with breeders and with local nurseries and planting these out, mostly at the UVM Horticulture Research Center, so that we can evaluate them objectively and try to give growers some data on cold hardiness and yield and juice quality.
Right, sure. It seems that that whole northern band, New York and Minnesota, I guess there's a whole strip of seeing what works, but also our soils are different.
And it's interesting you mentioned the northern band. There was a project we worked on for 5 or 6 years, called the Northern Grapes Project, and it was a major multi-state specialty crop research initiative funded effort. Ended a couple years ago just because of the funding, but it was really designed to coordinate information across universities, across growers, across wineries. And since that ended, those of us who've worked in it in Ohio and Iowa and Minnesota continue to collaborate on some projects, mostly around variety evaluation is where we've continued, but there's been other projects that are coming around. One thing I do want to throw a plug out, which is fairly of interest, is we were just selected to host the Vita Nord conference, which is the major international cold climate conference for grape growers. It won't be for 2 years. It'll be in December 2021. Okay. But we're getting the word out now. We just booked the hotel. And there will be several hundred growers from around the world that'll be converging and learning about how best to grow these grapes.
Oh, how exciting. That's fantastic. Yeah. They'll be here. All right, and the wine is pretty good.
The wine actually is very good. Yeah. It took a few years to gain the respect, I think, of the wine buying public. But there's certain wines like our Marquettes we're especially well known for, where some of our growers and winemakers literally are passing the trophy back and forth. It could be awarded to anyone in the country, but we keep winning it.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much. You know, if our viewers want more details about apples and grapes and other work being done at the UVM Hort Farm, you can go online to uvm.edu/Hort Farm. Another option is to check out Friends of the Hort Farm, which I love. It's a great website, which we've also listed on the screen. You can learn about workshops and other special programs going on there that are taking place at the farm. And Terry Bradshaw, so great to have you with us and talking about our real success with apples and cider apples and wine. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us across the fence. I'm Fran Stoddard.